May 1945. The war in Europe was gasping its final breaths, but the air in the Bavarian Alps was anything but calm. Along a narrow, winding road near Reutte, a convoy of American jeeps crawled past snow-streaked peaks, engines rumbling against the silence of surrender. Inside one of the trucks, a tall, gaunt man sat clutching a weathered notebook, its pages filled with diagrams of rockets that had once terrorized London. His name was Wernher von Braun. Around him, soldiers murmured in low tones, unsure whether they were escorting prisoners or prize possessions. A few miles east, Soviet patrols were pushing westward, hunting for the same men, the same secrets, the same future. Behind every lab door, every burnt file, and every frightened scientist lay the same question: who would inherit the mind of Nazi Germany? In those chaotic weeks, a new war had already begun, not for land, but for intellect. By early 1945, Germany was a nation collapsing under its own weight. The once invincible Reich had been reduced to smoldering ruins, its armies shattered, its leaders hiding behind concrete walls. Yet beneath the ashes of defeat lay a trove of knowledge unlike anything the world had ever seen. From the windswept coasts of Peenemünde to the deep underground tunnels of the Harz Mountains, teams of German scientists had pushed the boundaries of physics, chemistry, and aeronautics further than any Allied laboratory had dared. Their inventions were brutal and breathtaking: jet engines that could outfly sound, rockets that leapt beyond the edge of the atmosphere, nerve agents that could end cities, and radar systems capable of detecting bombers long before they appeared in the sky. These technologies had been forged in the crucible of war and driven by a regime that prized results over morality. When the Reich began to fall, its laboratories became more valuable than its generals. For the Allies, victory was already assured militarily. But intelligence officers and military planners understood a deeper truth: whoever controlled Germany's scientific mind would control the next century. The British called it Operation Surgeon, the Americans Operation Paperclip, the Soviets Operation Osoaviakhim. Each name represented the same mission: capture the brains before someone else did. Intelligence units began cataloging every research center, drafting lists of scientists, and racing across bombed landscapes to seize blueprints before they were burned. It was no longer about territory or ideology. It was about brains, formulas, and notebooks. In the crumbling corridors of Nazi research institutes, men who had once built weapons for Hitler now faced a new kind of calculation. To whom should they surrender? Some prayed for British civility, others sought American pragmatism, and many feared Soviet retribution. As Allied divisions advanced into central Germany, entire convoys of scientists and engineers began moving west, carrying their families, prototypes, and secrets. They were not fleeing the war. They were trying to choose their future. By April, Peenemünde had been bombed into near oblivion, and the remnants of the V2 program had scattered into the mountains of Thuringia. Wernher von Braun's team, knowing the Soviets were closing in, made the decision to surrender to the Americans. It was not an act of ideology, it was survival by calculation. At the same time, special Allied task forces like the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee and T-Forces swept through captured towns, securing documents, interrogating personnel, and packing crates of data marked confidential, scientific. The chase for human knowledge had begun before the ink of surrender was even dry. The war in Europe was ending, but in laboratories and tunnels across Germany, another front was taking shape, a silent front where no shots would be fired, but where the consequences would echo for generations. As the Reich disintegrated, the future of modern science and warfare lay scattered among the rubble, waiting for whichever flag reached it first. The summer of 1945 marked not just the end of a world war, but the beginning of a new global contest, one waged in laboratories, intelligence offices, and shadowed train stations. Germany, once the center of Europe's scientific power, had become a vast, open vault of technological secrets. From the V2 rockets lying in pieces across the Mittelwerk tunnels, to the experimental jet prototypes hidden in underground hangars, Every fragment of machinery represented both opportunity and danger. The Allied armies had entered Germany as conquerors, but soon they found themselves acting more like scavengers, collecting blueprints, notebooks, and human minds. What the world didn't know yet was that the spoils of this silent war would determine the shape of the Cold War and the future of space exploration. The United States moved first, quietly and efficiently. Under the supervision of the U.S. Army's Ordnance Corps and military intelligence units, teams began identifying, interrogating, and extracting scientists with expertise in rocket propulsion, aerodynamics, chemical engineering, and medicine. This covert operation, still unpublicized at the time, would soon gain its famous name, Operation Paperclip. The policy debates were fierce in Washington. Could men who had built weapons for Hitler be trusted to serve democracy? But as reports flowed in of Soviet units seizing entire laboratories, moral hesitation gave way to strategic necessity. By June 1945, hundreds of German engineers and technicians had been quietly moved to safe houses, awaiting transfer to America. The British, though slower to act, were no less determined. They understood that post-war survival depended on innovation, not empire. Britain's resources were strained, its cities in ruins, but its scientific establishment remained keenly aware of Germany's technological edge. The Royal Air Force and the Ministry of Supply launched their own missions, Operation Surgeon to capture aviation specialists, and Operation Backfire to reconstruct and test V-2 rockets from captured parts on the North Sea coast. British teams worked alongside Canadian and American officers, sometimes competing, sometimes cooperating, but always watching each other closely. For them, every new schematic could mean another leap in jet propulsion, radar precision, or guided missile control, advances that could not be ignored in a world still shivering from war. The Soviets, meanwhile, moved with characteristic secrecy and scale. Under the direction of Smersh and the NKVD, entire battalions swept through eastern Germany and Poland, seizing laboratories, factories, and personnel before the Western Allies could intervene. They dismantled entire research institutes, creating machinery, files, and even furniture, and transported them east. Stalin understood that industrial recovery alone would not secure the Soviet future. He needed brains, not just steel. Soviet officers offered German scientists incentives, homes, laboratories, protection, but the truth was clear. It was cooperation or disappearance. Many of these scientists would soon find themselves behind barbed wire in newly created research towns, their work fueling the rise of Soviet rocketry and nuclear science. For a brief moment in 1945, the ruins of Germany became the crossroads of the modern world. In the mountains of Thuringia, in the ruins of Peenemünde, in the university basements of Göttingen and Berlin, the fates of entire scientific fields were being redrawn. The Allies who had fought together to destroy the Third Reich were now preparing to outmaneuver one another. What had started as a military alliance was fracturing into a rivalry of intellect and ideology. The moral arguments faded into the background as intelligence reports piled up, each describing new breakthroughs in propulsion, radar, and atomic research. The Americans had von Braun, the British had jet experts like Hans Multhaup, and the Soviets were building their own scientific colonies with engineers taken from German soil. The world was no longer divided by borders, but by the invisible lines of information, data, formulae, and expertise that would soon decide which nation reached the sky first. By the time the Nuremberg trials began later that year, the real struggle had already moved underground. It wasn't about justice, it was about knowledge. The Allies weren't merely ending a war, they were designing the future. And in that quiet, calculated race for genius, Germany's defeat had become the foundation of a new world order. Beneath the sweeping political maneuvers and military operations lay the most complex dimension of all, the human one. For the German scientists and engineers caught in the collapse of the Reich, survival was no longer about ideology, but about pragmatism. Many of them had built their careers under the Nazi system, some willingly, others reluctantly. Men like Wernher von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and Walter Dornberger, were now forced to confront a brutal moral equation: surrender their knowledge to the victors, or risk obliteration at the hands of the Soviets. Their laboratories had been funded by a monstrous regime, yet their discoveries had pushed the boundaries of science in ways that would soon change the world. In the final weeks of the war, families packed their belongings, burned incriminating documents, and waited for the first Allied soldiers to appear, not to arrest them, but to offer them a chance to keep their lives and their work intact. These were men who had watched entire cities vanish in flames, but still believed in the purity of invention. To them, science was not politics. It was survival. On the ground, the tactical struggle for these minds resembled a secret military campaign all its own. Specialized Allied intelligence teams, such as the U.S. Army's Technical Industrial Intelligence Committee, TIIC, and the British T-Forces, operated deep behind advancing front lines. Their mission was not to capture soldiers, but to seize scientists, laboratories, and documentation before they could fall into enemy hands. Trucks filled with technical drawings and prototype components rolled out of research centers under armed escort, while competing Allied units sometimes arrived at the same location within hours of each other. American officers would seal off a factory under security orders, only to have British agents arrive the next morning claiming authority from London. In some cases, the same scientists were interrogated 3 times in 3 different uniforms. The front line was no longer a battlefield. It was a chessboard of laboratories, rail depots, and half-destroyed towns. Meanwhile, the technological stakes were beyond comprehension. The Americans were obsessed with long-range rocketry and jet propulsion, technologies that could extend their global reach. They had learned through bitter experience that whoever could strike fastest and from the furthest distance would dominate the next war. The British, scarred by the Blitz and struggling with post-war exhaustion, focused on radar, jet aircraft, and guided munitions, tools that would guarantee their defensive edge. The Soviets, recovering from unimaginable devastation, pursued an entirely different strategy. They aimed to recreate German research from the ground up, replicating every machine, every formula, every test range, regardless of cost. To each power, the captured German intellect represented something different: progress, security, revenge. But to the scientists themselves, it was a ticket to survival in a divided world. For these men, the war had ended only in name. The sound of artillery was gone, but the echo of competition lingered in every negotiation, every coded message, every train that departed in the night. Some scientists were treated like heroes, others like traitors. Most were simply bargaining chips in a geopolitical game they had no control over. Yet, as they signed their surrender papers and boarded Allied vehicles, few of them realized that their work, born in the ashes of the Third Reich, would soon fuel a far greater contest. The age of atomic rivalry, spaceflight, and intercontinental reach was dawning, and they were its unwilling architects. Above the scramble in the ruins and laboratories, the fate of German science was being decided in conference rooms and war offices thousands of miles away. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman wrestled with an uneasy balance between moral principle and strategic survival. Officially, the United States had adopted a strict denazification policy. No former Nazi was to hold influence or authority in the post-war world. But within the Pentagon, the tone was different. The Cold War was already casting its shadow across Europe, and the question was no longer about punishment, but advantage. Could America afford to let Soviet hands seize the mines that had built the V-2, the Messerschmitt 262, and the nerve agents of Tabun and Sarin? The Army Ordnance Corps argued that it could not. In confidential memoranda, they pressed for exemptions, urging that technical value outweighs political background. Thus was born the quiet authorization for Operation Paperclip, a moral compromise that would bring hundreds of German scientists to American soil, their records sanitized and their pasts erased under new identities. In London, the dilemma was equally profound. Britain's empire was shrinking, its finances drained, yet its scientific ambitions refused to fade. The Ministry of Aircraft Production and the Royal Air Force fought for influence, launching their own intelligence hunts across occupied Germany. Operations such as Surgeon and Backfire aimed to secure the same human and technical assets that the Americans coveted, but under the guise of reconstruction, not competition. The British focused particularly on aviation, swept-wing designs, axial flow jet engines, and radar systems far beyond their wartime capabilities. They offered captured scientists short-term contracts, presenting cooperation as a professional partnership rather than an act of surrender. But behind the polite language of letters and visas lay the same urgency: stay ahead of Moscow or be left behind forever. In Moscow, however, there were no illusions about morality. Stalin and Lavrenti Beria had already decided that technology, not ideology, would secure the Soviet Union's future. Soviet intelligence systematically compiled lists of German specialists, engineers, and even factory workers, marking those deemed critical to reconstruction. When the Red Army advanced through Saxony and Thuringia, NKVD units followed closely, detaining scientists, packing up laboratories, and shipping equipment east. Entire research towns, Bleicherode, Nordhausen, Kleinbodungen, were stripped bare. In late 1946, under the colossal Operation Osoaviakhim, thousands of German experts and their families were transported overnight to the Soviet Union. There, behind guarded perimeters, they rebuilt the technologies they had once designed for Hitler, now for Stalin. The moral questions that troubled Washington and London did not exist in Moscow. What mattered was capability, and the Soviets were determined to replicate every discovery, even if it meant using the men who had once targeted their cities. Then there was the invisible war, the one waged not by armies, but by counterintelligence agencies. Both the Americans and the British struggled to keep their activities hidden, not only from the Soviets, but from each other. Scientists were quietly reassigned or debriefed, their names removed from official lists to prevent rival teams from locating them. Convoys of trucks carrying dismantled rocket parts disappeared into forests under heavy guard. The press was told nothing, the public even less. Each side feared that the other might uncover a secret that could tip the balance of post-war power. The Allies had won the war together, but they were already preparing for the next one, against each other. And beneath it all lay the moral tension that would haunt the 20th century. Could the pursuit of knowledge ever be separated from the crimes that produced it? The men of Paperclip, Surgeon, and Osoaviakhim were not innocent. Many had overseen forced labor or designed weapons that killed thousands. Yet the superpowers who captured them chose to look forward, not backward. They justified their decisions with a single haunting logic: if we don't use their knowledge, the enemy will. In that calculation lay both the genius and the darkness of the modern age. The war for land was over, but the war for minds had only just begun. On the night of October 27, 1946, silence fell across the occupied zones of eastern Germany. But beneath that silence, thousands of footsteps echoed in unison. Soviet trucks rumbled into small towns and industrial sites across Thuringia, Saxony, and Mecklenburg. At precisely midnight, the operation began. Its code name was Osoaviakhim, and its purpose was brutally simple: seize every German scientist, engineer, and technician of strategic value, along with their families, archives, and equipment, and relocate them to the Soviet Union before dawn. It was not a raid, it was an abduction carried out with military precision. By sunrise, an estimated 2,200 specialists and more than 6,000 family members were on sealed trains bound east. The Soviets did not bother to hide it. They considered it reparations, intellectual compensation for a nation that had lost more than 20 million lives to German aggression. In towns like Bleicherode and Nordhausen, where the remnants of the V-2 rocket teams had been working under temporary Allied supervision, Soviet officers moved quickly. Engineers who had gone to bed expecting another day of work under British or American oversight awoke to find soldiers pounding on their doors. They were given 30 minutes to pack. Some refused, others pleaded, but resistance was useless. Families were separated. Research facilities were stripped bare. Even furniture was loaded onto freight cars. Entire institutes disappeared overnight. The Mittelwerk tunnels, once the heart of Hitler's rocket dream, were emptied of their remaining equipment and expertise. Within a week, that same expertise would reappear behind barbed wire in Soviet research towns like Podlipki, Gorodomlya, and Kapustin Yar. For Moscow, this was the great equalizer. Stalin's advisors had warned that the West was already ahead in aviation and atomic research, and that Germany's engineers could bridge the gap. The Americans had von Braun. The Soviets would have Helmut Grotrup and his team. Under the guidance of Soviet chief designer Sergei Korolev, these German scientists became silent laborers in the creation of the first Soviet ballistic missiles. They built the R-1, a near-exact replica of the V-2, and later contributed data that led to the R-7, the rocket that would one day carry Sputnik into orbit. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The same men who had built weapons for Hitler were now building the foundations of Soviet space power. News of the Soviet action spread quickly through Western intelligence circles, sending shockwaves across London and Washington. The Allied command had known that the Soviets were taking scientists, but the scale and speed of Osoaviakhim were staggering. Within 48 hours, British and American officers realized that dozens of key figures on their recruitment lists had vanished. In response, urgency turned into panic. Memos marked "Top Secret, Eyes Only" raced between departments. The Americans knew that hesitation meant defeat, not in war, but in technology. The race was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time. And so, even as the world celebrated peace, cargo planes began to take off from Europe's battered airfields, carrying a very different kind of cargo: men, notebooks, and machines that represented the next century. The Soviets had made their move, and the Americans were ready to make theirs. In the shadows of moral compromise, the two superpowers had finally drawn their lines. The silent front had become a global one. In the wake of the Soviet raids, the United States accelerated its own operation with unprecedented urgency. What had begun as a discreet initiative known only to a handful of intelligence officers now transformed into a coordinated global extraction campaign. Operation Paperclip, as it was finally named, was no longer a secret. It was a mission of national survival. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Department, the War Department's Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, and the Army Air Forces began moving methodically across occupied Germany, seizing scientists, research documents, and prototypes before the Soviets could reach them. Men like Wernher von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Kurt Debus, and Hermann Oberth, once the architects of Hitler's long-range vengeance weapons, were quietly transferred under U.S. custody. Their Nazi Party affiliations were deliberately scrubbed from files, their SS memberships omitted from official biographies. By late 1946, hundreds of German specialists had been transported to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, where they began testing and reconstructing V-2 rockets under American supervision. In the deserts of the American Southwest, the same weapons that had once terrorized London now rose into the skies as symbols of American ambition. Engineers in Army uniforms studied trajectory patterns, blast yields, and guidance systems, absorbing every lesson the Germans had learned through years of wartime experimentation. Von Braun and his team, confined yet respected, were treated as prized assets rather than prisoners. Under tight security, they lectured American engineers, drew blueprints from memory, and translated thousands of pages of data. Each test firing at White Sands marked a step closer to a future that neither the Nazis nor the Allies had fully envisioned. A world where rockets would no longer deliver bombs, but satellites and eventually men beyond Earth's horizon. Across the Atlantic, the British were racing to hold their own ground. Operation Backfire unfolded at Cuxhaven, where British and Canadian scientists, assisted by captured German engineers, assembled and launched several reconstructed V-2 rockets. The tests were meticulously recorded, measurements, fuel ratios, guidance performance, all analyzed by the Ministry of Supply and shared with Allied aeronautical institutions. At the same time, Operation Surgeon had transferred German jet specialists into Britain's shrinking aviation industry, feeding vital data into the development of next-generation aircraft. The Rolls-Royce Nene jet engine and de Havilland Comet would both later owe parts of their design lineage to knowledge salvaged from German archives. For Britain, exhausted but proud, these operations represented a chance to remain scientifically relevant in a world dominated by superpowers. Yet beneath these advances, a quiet unease persisted. Many of the men now celebrated as pioneers had been complicit in atrocities. At Mittelwerk, thousands of slave laborers had died building the same rockets now paraded as marvels of engineering. Their stories were buried under layers of classified documentation. When questioned about their pasts, most of the German scientists insisted they had only followed orders, that their work had been purely technical, not moral. The Americans, desperate to stay ahead of the Soviets, rarely pressed the issue. Files marked potential security risk were quietly amended with new employment titles, new birthplaces, new names. It was, as one intelligence officer later admitted, a clean sheet written in pencil. By 1947, as Germany's ruins gave way to reconstruction, the map of post-war science had hardened into two distinct empires. In the West, American and British institutions were rebuilding global technological dominance under the promise of freedom and innovation. In the East, the Soviet Union was constructing its scientific machine through discipline, secrecy, and control. The front lines had shifted from Berlin and Stalingrad to Cape Canaveral and Baikonur. What had once been a war fought with tanks and artillery was now being waged with equations, propulsion chambers, and microseconds. The race for the future was no longer hypothetical. It had a face, a sound, and a heartbeat. The scientists who had built weapons of terror were now building instruments of exploration, but the moral weight of their work remained. Behind every launch plume and every new discovery stood a truth the world preferred to forget. The foundations of modern power had been forged in the rubble of moral collapse. In the years that followed, the world entered a new age of progress, one built on the intellect extracted from the ruins of Nazi Germany. In the United States, the Operation Paperclip scientists quickly became central figures in the nation's emerging aerospace and missile programs. At White Sands Proving Ground, V-2 rockets were disassembled, reassembled, and launched under American supervision, each test refining the data that would eventually lead to the Redstone and Jupiter missile systems. Wernher von Braun, the once celebrated engineer of the Third Reich, was now the polished face of American rocketry. He lectured at universities, wrote articles in Collier's magazine, and appeared on Walt Disney television specials, promoting the dream of space travel as if the horrors of Mittelwerk had never existed. The American public saw him as a visionary. Few knew of the slave labor that had built his machines. In a country racing to outpace the Soviet Union, redemption came easily to those who could build faster, fly higher, and reach further. The German engineers under Paperclip were given resources beyond anything they had imagined in wartime Germany. Laboratories at Fort Bliss, Redstone Arsenal, and later Huntsville, Alabama, became the nerve centers of U.S. missile development. The Americans learned quickly. Within a decade, the same principles that had guided the V-2's flight path were powering intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of carrying nuclear warheads across oceans. The moral debates that had briefly flickered in Washington were extinguished by the glow of technological success. In the logic of the Cold War, whoever built the most advanced weapons ensured peace through fear. Paperclip had delivered not just expertise, it had delivered deterrence. But the influence of the captured German scientists extended beyond the battlefield. The biomedical specialists, such as Hubertus Strughold, brought with them extensive research into human physiology, pressure tolerance, and aerospace medicine. Much of their wartime data, obtained under conditions of profound ethical violation, was quietly integrated into U.S. Air Force and NASA studies. By the mid-1950s, Strughold was known as the father of space medicine, his Nazi record largely forgotten. It was a recurring pattern. The darker the origin, the brighter the reinvention. America's desire for advancement left little room for reflection. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Britain was reaping its own rewards from the intellectual spoils of war. The data gathered from Operation Backfire and Surgeon invigorated British aeronautics at a crucial moment. The Miles M52 experimental aircraft, though eventually cancelled, pioneered the swept-wing design that would influence future supersonic jets. Rolls-Royce engineers benefited from German turbojet technology, producing engines that powered both military and civilian aircraft throughout the 1950s. Even the early concepts for the Blue Streak missile owed a debt to knowledge extracted from German blueprints. Yet Britain's ambitions soon collided with economic reality. Lacking the vast industrial funding of its American ally, it gradually ceded leadership in rocketry to the United States, focusing instead on aviation excellence and radar innovation. Still, for a small island recovering from devastation, the German contribution had bought Britain a decade of scientific advantage. In the Soviet Union, the results of Osoaviakhim began to bear fruit almost immediately. Under the oversight of Soviet chief designer Sergei Korolev, the transplanted German teams at Podlipki and Gorodomlya Island rebuilt the V-2 from memory, creating the R-1 in record time. By 1948, Soviet engineers were already adapting the design into more powerful models, the R-2, R-5, and eventually the R-7, which would carry Sputnik 1 into orbit in 1957. The Germans in the USSR worked under close supervision, often in isolation, but their influence was undeniable. While the Americans refined their Redstone and Atlas missiles, the Soviets were preparing to announce their arrival in the heavens. The space race, though decades in the making, was born out of this grim transplantation of intellect. Everywhere, the same paradox lingered. The very technologies that had once embodied destruction were now driving humanity's greatest achievements. Rockets once aimed at London were now reaching for the stars. Jet engines that had carried bombs were now transporting passengers. Even the mathematical models that had calculated ballistic trajectories were being repurposed for peaceful exploration. Yet beneath the triumphs, the moral debt remained unpaid. The scientists had changed sides, the uniforms had changed color, but the shadows of their origins still followed them. The three victorious powers, United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union, had each gained more than they had dared imagine. Their victories were no longer measured in battles won, but in ideas captured. What had begun as a desperate wartime scramble had evolved into a permanent realignment of global power. The Cold War was no longer a confrontation of armies. It was a duel of intellects, born from the same soil that had once burned beneath Allied bombs. By the early 1950s, the human and political consequences of this intellectual conquest were becoming impossible to ignore. Thousands of German scientists, engineers, and technicians were now living under new flags, working in foreign laboratories, and raising their families in countries that had once called them enemies. Some adapted easily, learning English or Russian, and embracing their new identities as contributors to peace through progress. Others lived in quiet exile, haunted by guilt, suspicion, or the loss of their homeland. For many, the work itself became a means of survival, a way to bury the past beneath equations, patents, and technical triumphs. But history, as it always does, eventually began to ask questions. In the United States, the number of German specialists brought in under Operation Paperclip eventually surpassed 1,600, not including thousands more technicians and assistants who arrived later through secondary programs. By the mid-1960s, many had become respected figures within NASA, the U.S. Air Force, and private aerospace firms. Their fingerprints could be found on nearly every major project of the Cold War era. The Redstone missile, the Atlas ICBM, and the Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. The American narrative reframed them as symbols of ingenuity and redemption, men who had helped turn the tools of war into engines of exploration. Yet beneath that triumph, buried in classified archives and forgotten testimonies, remained the darker record of their pasts. In the early 1980s, declassified documents revealed that several of these scientists had been directly complicit in war crimes, including the use of slave labor and human experimentation. For decades, the government had knowingly concealed their histories. By then, most of them were retired or dead. Britain's smaller but significant recruitment program produced its own legacy of moral complexity. Though British intelligence had vetted most of its German recruits, later investigations uncovered that some had also been tied to wartime research involving forced labor or unethical experimentation. The revelation was quietly handled. With little public outrage by then, the contributions of these men had already been absorbed into the national narrative of technological recovery. The radar systems that protected British skies, the aircraft that spanned the Empire's last decades, even the engines that powered civilian aviation, all carried a trace of knowledge taken from the Third Reich. It was a silent inheritance, neither celebrated nor condemned. In the Soviet Union, many of the German specialists captured during Osoaviakhim found themselves caught in a paradoxical fate. After years of intense productivity, they were gradually phased out as Soviet engineers gained confidence and expertise of their own. By the early 1950s, most of the German teams had been dismissed, relocated, or allowed to return home under strict surveillance. Some returned to East Germany and reintegrated into its newly founded research institutions, helping establish what would become the German Democratic Republic's modest but efficient technical sector. Others, disillusioned or broken, disappeared into obscurity. Yet the mark they left on Soviet science was indelible. Their early contributions had set the trajectory for the missiles that would later carry nuclear warheads and spacecraft into the skies. By the late 20th century, historians began to uncover the full scale of the operation and the moral cost it carried. The documents once hidden in military archives were declassified, revealing the uncomfortable truth that both Western democracies and the Soviet Union had benefited from men who should have faced justice at Nuremberg. The debate over ethics versus progress reignited, forcing nations to confront their own selective memory. Were these scientists heroes of science or beneficiaries of impunity? The answer depended on which side of the Iron Curtain one stood. Still, despite the controversy, the legacy of the post-war brain hunt remained undeniable. The technologies born from it reshaped the modern world. Jet travel, ballistic missiles, satellite communications, and space exploration all carried the imprint of that race to capture minds. What began as an act of opportunism in the ruins of Germany had evolved into the foundation of global modernity. The war had ended, but its echoes lived on in every rocket that rose skyward and every radar that swept the horizon. The soldiers had returned home, but the scientists had redrawn the future. In the quiet decades that followed the war, as the world turned its gaze to the stars and the promises of technology, few stopped to consider the origins of that progress. The gleaming rockets on launch pads, the jetliners streaking across continents, the satellites orbiting above, all bore the invisible fingerprints of a moral bargain struck in the ashes of 1945. The nations that had defeated tyranny had also absorbed its intellect, justifying it as a necessity of survival. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union each emerged stronger, more advanced, and infinitely more powerful, yet each carried within its triumph the stain of compromise. The war for minds had ended in victory, but not in innocence. For the scientists themselves, the years that followed brought both glory and silence. Some, like Wernher von Braun, stood before cameras and crowds as heroes of a new frontier, their pasts buried beneath the radiance of their achievements. Others lived quietly, their names erased or remembered only in classified files. They had transcended nations, crossing ideological lines with the same precision that once guided their rockets. Their loyalty had never been to flags, but to formulas, to the pursuit of discovery regardless of the price. Yet even they could not escape the paradox of their own creation. The very tools that had promised to elevate mankind also armed it with the power to destroy itself. The missile and the moon rocket were two sides of the same invention. History, in its quiet cruelty, often redeems genius faster than it forgives guilt. The war for minds proved that morality could bend beneath the weight of ambition, and that human progress often walks hand in hand with human forgetting. But within that uneasy truth lies another lesson, that knowledge itself is never evil, only the hands that wield it. The Allied powers may have divided Germany's genius among themselves, but what they truly inherited was a reflection of their own nature, the unending drive to outthink, outbuild, and outlast one another, even at the cost of conscience. And so, as the final truck rolled down the mountain road in 1945, its headlights cutting through the mist, its cargo not of gold or steel but of mines, the world quietly crossed a threshold. The guns had fallen silent, but a new race had begun, one that would never truly end. From those shadows of surrender, the future of humanity had already taken flight.